Now, does the state actually have fewer deer because of this, or did it just all move to Orono?
Well, our study certainly can't speak to causality, but, if you don't have the habitat, you can't really expect the deer to be there. And the question that deer wintering habitat has declined in northern and eastern Maine, everybody accepts as it has.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. We're back. Sorry I haven't been around for the last several weeks. Who knew you could be quarantined for Ebola for that long? So let me ask the seasonal question. Did you get your deer yet? If you went up in the North Maine woods, probably not. Over the last couple of decades, the deer herd has shrunk in northern Maine. Now there is a comprehensive study that has just come out that looks at what happened to the habitat in the deer wintering areas. I'll be spending the next hour with Erin Simons-Lagarde in her office at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. It turns out they've been studying satellite maps dating back to 1975. And you can watch Maine's forest and deer habitat change right before your eyes. And not in a good way for deer. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. So as I settle down in the guest chair of our office, my first question to you, Erin, is what are you?
I am. I'm a research assistant professor. I used to be a postdoc in Department of Wildlife Ecology, which has now changed its name. I can't remember. It's a rather long name now that has conservation biology in it and fisheries now. But after 2010, I believe, I moved over to School of Forest Resources.
Okay. So
I've been around the block.
So you've seen it all, I take it. We're going to talk about a particular study that the School of Forest Resources did, and it's called The Effectiveness of State Regulations to Protect Deer Wintering Habitat in Maine. Mm-hmm. That's a long name that meant what?
Well, the impetus for the study was thinking about what it would mean if IF&W were to achieve their land-based objectives for deer management in northern and eastern Maine. Just asking some what-if questions. What would that mean for the forest and for, as close as we could get to it, the forest-based economy? Mm-hmm. For a study area that we've been working on for some time, it developed around questions of lynx and marten, but the methods were flexible enough that we felt like we could take a look at deer habitat as well. So we did.
Okay, was there a particular study area, or did you look at all unorganized territories or North Woods?
We had a pre-existing study area that we had developed as part of my dissertation that covered a 4 million acre chunk of northwestern Maine, mm-hmm.
All
in the unorganized territory area. I guess that won't help for here. I have pictures.
You can show me pictures.
Okay.
Let me take a look here.
So that gray area there
mm-hmm.
has been a focal area for us for some time.
So just that stretches from about, Churchill or Lake Chamberlain right over to the western Maine border, down as far as, it looks like at least Jackman.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We had data for that area in hand. And so by data, I mean sort of the core of our research program uses satellite imagery from the Landsat satellites, mm-hmm.
A
couple of different ones, which are very, very good at picking up on forest disturbance. You can compare images between dates and see clear cuts as well as partial harvests. They're also quite good at giving us information about forest composition. So we can sort of combine those two pieces together and say, okay, well, here was the conifer forest in this earlier date. Here's where harvesting has happened, and here's the where impacted conifer, which of course was our sort of focal interest for the deer project. For marten, it was more mm-hmm. general forest in general. For lynx, it was something else. But we have these sort of pieces that we can combine in different ways to look at change of a given forest type through time.
Now, most of us who would look at satellite imagery are looking at Google Earth. That's not the same thing as what you're looking at.
It's not. These satellites, the ones that we like to use, pass overhead every 16 days, and they have 7 bands of information. So they take pictures, not just in the visible, what you see on Google or Earth, but also additional information that we can't see with the naked eye that actually gives us a lot of additional information about things like forest productivity mm-hmm. and forest composition that we can use to look at things like where has forest biomass decreased as a consequence of forest disturbance via harvesting, or it doesn't actually have to be harvesting. It could be blowdown, could be insect defoliation. So because we have that additional information that we can't see with the naked eye, it actually gives us our means in for looking at these questions of disturbance by different agents up in northern forest, where we can't cover 4 million acres, with ground data. We can't have people walking over that much area, but with satellites, one satellite image captures that whole entire area.
Now, can you actually tell the species of trees from these satellite images based on, I don't know, off-gassing or infrared light, or what? How do you do it?
Right, you do. So within the visible range, you can actually tell quite a bit. You can clearly identify conifer from hardwood, and then if you dig down into those additional bands of information, you can start to tell apart different species. So we have species maps of all of Maine's sort of the top 13 most abundant, most ecologically, economically important species that we can also sort of bring to bear on these kinds of questions. We didn't in the deer project because that's newer data, which we didn't have available at the time. We were able just to parse the landscape in terms of forest type. Conifer-dominated, hardwood-dominated, mixed.
Now, you've seen a change over time? Because this study went on for a long time, didn't it?
Well, the study itself spanned the period 1975 to 2007, because with the Landsat satellite archive, we can actually go all the way back. Our first snapshot of Maine's landscape starts in 1975, and then because it's going overhead many times every year, we can piece together a time series of images that allow us to tell the whole story from 1975 to present, where forest disturbance has happened, where has it been clear cuts, where has it been partial harvests, and what does the forest after, the forest that comes back, what does that look like too? So what was there before, and what does it look like now?
So what jumped out at you when you looked at these contrasts?
Well, the story is, with respect to mature conifer in particular, is is a stark one.
Yeah, isn't it?
Going back, because we're able to capture that, even pre-salvage, pre-outbreak period in the early 70s, we can see all the salvage activity. We can get a real handle on the acreages affected in a spatially explicit way. And we could see the harvest tail off as a consequence of the end of the outbreak and salvage period, the implementation of the Forest Practices Act, all those things played out on the landscape, and you can just see the effects most clearly with mature conifer, with its significant, hit during the salvage and outbreak period.
Now, when you're talking salvage and outbreak, you mean spruce budworm?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. So the last most recent outbreak of spruce budworm occurred between 1975 and 1983. And that led to widespread pre-salvage and salvage activity. And then subsequent to that, there was, of course, the Maine Forest Practices Act, which caused a real change in forest management in northern Maine, a real shift away from clear-cut activities and much more partial harvesting, and the satellites pick up on that as well. Can
you actually, as you compare, can you see a change on the very year that the law took effect?
Almost.
Is it that
difficult?
Wow.
It is really quite that stark. The size and shape of clear cuts almost changed overnight, from large to small, and with the sort of leaf strips in between, the patterns changed quite quickly over just a few years.
My guest is Erin Simons-Lagarde, a research assistant professor at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. Along with her faculty colleague, Dr. Dan Harrison, the school has been looking at 32 years of satellite imagery to figure out what happened to northern Maine's deer herd. Right now, we're focused on what happened to the trees. Later in the show, I'll ask this question about coyotes. Current policy seems to place a lot of emphasis on killing coyotes in order to bring back a deer herd. If there's no habitat for them, especially if the snow is just flat out too deep, is that going to get us anywhere, or can you reach a conclusion like that yet?
Well, obviously that wasn't part of our study, but...
Stay with Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, and we'll see what comes after the but here on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This show was on hold for the last few weeks. Apparently there was some kind of election going on. Well, thank goodness that's over and we can focus on what really matters. Deer. And the lack of deer in the North Woods. I'm in the office of Erin Simons-Lagarde, a research assistant professor at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. And we're talking about big changes to the North Woods that they've been tracking for decades. A couple of decades ago, a spruce budworm epidemic decimated much of the conifer forest that deer use for winter warmth and safety. Now, Erin, after all that wood was salvaged and the forest started to come back, did we get spruce again or did we get a different set of trees?
We, in many areas, did get a different set of trees. There was a much bigger effort towards herbicide application than there is now, but it was a large area that would have needed to be covered by a herbicide to keep back all of the hardwood regeneration. So the sort of conventional wisdom that you hear is that we lost 1 million acres of spruce fir from areas that were spruce fir dominated that are now dominated by hardwoods, and that also does we see the same kind of spatial picture of that in the satellite archive too.
Okay, what does all this mean to deer then?
Well, as we all know, they need mature conifer habitat, and that was what was most affected during that salvage period. And it's not like harvesting just altogether stopped in mature conifer. Spruce fir, although no longer accounts for the majority of pulpwood, it still accounts for the majority of saw logs. So we still see significant activity in mature conifer. And it was because it was the mature forest habitat that was most hit during the salvage period. Eventually it looks like there's no way to avoid a bit of a bottleneck as we wait for all of that young spruce fir to get to merchantable age, which it's getting close, but it's not there yet. And as we're waiting for that to happen,
you've got the old stuff.
We've got the old stuff that just year after year continues to diminish as cutting continues. And those are the areas that the deer need.
Anecdotally, as I drive around the Maine woods, which I do a lot, the forest looks like it got a whole lot younger.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yep, and that shows up in everybody's data. Ours, FIA, any data you look at shows that we have a younger forest, particularly with respect to the spruce fir component. It's much younger now than it was in the 1970s during the last outbreak.
Now, does the state actually have fewer deer because of this, or did it just all move to Orono?
Well, our study certainly can't speak to causality, but, if you don't have the habitat, you can't really expect the deer to be there. And the question that deer wintering habitat has declined in northern and eastern Maine, everybody accepts as it has.
Okay. Now, what is exactly wintering habitat? Yes, it's conifer, but why is that important?
Well, the conifer trees, particularly, primary wintry shelter habitat, is usually considered conifer-dominated habitat where you've got a lot of cedar, spruce, fir, maybe some hemlock. That's at least 35 feet tall, which usually means at least 35 to 40 years old, and has canopy crown closure of 70%. So that means when you look up, the crowns of the adjacent trees are touching. And what that allows is a lot of snow interception. So we've got hardwood areas, right, that have no leaves. All the snow falls through to the ground. Deer have to walk through that.
And they can't run away easily.
And they can't run away easily. And in these conifer-dominated areas, the trees themselves just provide that additional snow interception and protection. So some of that snow evaporates. Some falls through as water, and that also reduces the snowpack. And so you've got a couple different sort of biological processes that are reducing the snow depth within a mature conifer stand compared to a mature hardwood stand. I think it's probably by as much as 30 to 50% difference in depth.
Is there also an impact on the interaction between deer and coyotes when they're in there?
Well, chances are good because habitat plays a mediating role. You've got better forest cover, thermal cover. That also means that you have better escape cover. So the equation there seems pretty straightforward.
Okay. A lot of this had to do with how the zoning was taking place in the North Woods, because under the old Land Use Regulatory Commission, LURC, there was an attempt to zone where these special places were. It was never clear to me if that had any regulatory teeth, or was that just advisory, or how did that all play out?
It did seem like it had regulatory teeth, at least in the beginning, when the first initial push to zone those areas occurred. If an area, once zoned, any timber harvesting activities within that zone then has to have a management plan, and the landowner has to work with IF&W. And so it did seem to come with some regulatory teeth. And I'm not well versed on it, but I certainly think I've heard in the last few years about fines. The question of fines coming up for landowners that have cut too heavily within zone deer yards.
Yeah, is there any buffer around these zone deer yards, or was it really just the deer yard itself that was protected?
Just the deer yard, and not even really just the deer yard, usually just some small portion of the deer yard. I think that struck some balance between sort of landowner objectives and sort of deer habitat management objectives, but the end result was most of the zoned deer yards in the unorganized territories are small, and they tend to be fairly linear, and really just smallish buffers around sort of riparian areas. So how representative they actually are of the active deer yard, I don't know, but it certainly seems, they certainly look very, very small to me.
So essentially you would have a fairly large coniferous patch, part of which was zoned for protecting the herd, and the rest could be harvested.
Absolutely.
Now, when you looked at these over the course of time, especially after all the salvage operations were done, did you see a lot of map indications that these were being harvested heavily?
Well, within the zones, it sort of seemed like the zones were doing their job in the sense that harvesting rates within those actual little boundaries were much less than the larger landscape. So in that sense, they worked. But right on the other side of those boundaries, because there is no buffer around those zoned, exactly delineated zoned boundaries, the presence of those zones seemed to have no effect on harvesting behavior in that larger landscape. We looked both at harvesting within the zones and also harvesting within a 1 1/4 mile buffer around those areas, trying to get a better sense of sort of the landscape that deer are likely to use, and recognizing that these deer yards probably, these individual small deer yards are probably part of a complex, trying to capture that. And within those larger buffers, we saw huge impacts of harvesting.
So essentially you've got little islands of conifers and then cutting right up to the edge of it and really kind of decimated.
Right. So we did see big impacts. Most, all the buffers got harvested pretty much right out of the box, and then we looked at area effects. So there's the question of how many areas got harvested, just a count, basically, and what was the extent of harvesting. And over time, what we found was the zones themselves, 90% of them between 1975 and 2007 had received some form of harvesting. Now, it's hard for us to account for exactly when a zone got delineated, make sure that the years all, because that information wasn't available. But as you move forward in time, things get more and more correct. So, but how much forest was actually harvested by clear cut was pretty low. It was in the low 20s within the zones. But if you look at the larger landscape, you go from an area effect of in the low 20s to about 50%. 50% of the mature forest within 1 1/4 mile of the deer wintering areas went from being mature to regenerating. So that doesn't even account for the partial harvesting effect. We're just focusing on those stand replacing harvests like clear cuts.
Now, this is all stuff you can see from satellite photos, but at any point did you send grad students in there to look and see if there were actually deer in there in the winter?
No, that's certainly something that IF&W does, is their helicopter surveys of the deer wintering areas, and I would love to sort of take that information and incorporate it into our analysis, but nope, there wasn't money to do that.
No, I figured there probably wasn't.
No.
Erin Simons-Lagarde is my guest. She's a research assistant professor at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. What we know so far is that deer wintering yards in the North Maine woods have shrunk, and the deer herd has shrunk with them. But what else is going on? Deer got to move, but what if they can't get there from here? That and coyotes are coming up as Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine continues on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. For a long time, we've been talking about deer disappearing in the North Maine woods. And the longer we talk about it, the fewer there are. A new report has come out from the University of Maine School of Forest Resources showing the deer wintering areas have diminished. Erin Simons-Lagarde did much of the work in the report, and I'm in her office. There's an importance to connectivity. Deer, I presume, have to move, A, because I'm guessing in these conifer forests there's not a lot of actual food for them underneath all those boughs. They get out and paw out some grasses or something they can eat. Mm-hmm. So they got to come out of there, and they presumably have to move around when conditions change or threats come. So how much importance is now placed on connectivity between these little islands?
Well, I think there's recognition that it's important, but that recognition hasn't translated into the zoning process. But my sense of the direction that IF&W has moved is more towards cooperative agreements, which do tend to be larger. And with cooperative agreements, I think they have greater latitude to incorporate ideas of connectivity, not just looking at these primary winter shelter areas, but the larger landscape in which they sit.
Yeah. Has the Forest Resources School had any part in that relationship between IF&W and the landowners? Are you advising? That's a good question.
Not me. This research was funded in part by the Cooperative Forestry Research Unit. They're very aware of it. We are hopefully in the next month or so going to put out a report on the research through CFRU. And CFRU has in it representative members from most of the large landowners within the Northern Forest. So there is a certain level of connection between us and our research and the landowners of the Northern Forest. How the degree to which that has informed any actual on the ground, right. Implementation of cooperative agreements is entirely unclear to me.
It probably is important to mention, though, that a lot of the landowners and the forest products people are aware of the problem and concerned about it.
Yes.
And in fact, they're really rather assisting in the process of trying to figure this out, as I understand it.
Yes. No, they're very engaged. I mean, I think the short history that led up to the project, I think, was as much spurred by the interest of forest landowners and getting a better understanding of deer wintering habitat, where it was now, how it had changed through time. Everybody needed a more comprehensive assessment because up to the point of this project, everything was fairly piecemeal. In part because it's hard to get spatial data over large areas. And that's what you need in order to get a comprehensive assessment.
Any idea how much wintering habitat we would need in order to restore the deer herd to what it was historically?
Well, we tried to take a look at least at how much habitat it would take to achieve IF&W's objectives of encompassing 8 to 10% of the land base. And deferring to their judgment that that's what it would take. And based off of of our research, currently within our study area, there's about 1 to 2% of the land base that is currently zoned as PFW for deer. And to get that up towards 8 to 10% of the landscape, we found, in our case, we would have to zone close to 340,000 new acres of zoning. And that was one of the questions we wanted to ask, right? So just saying 8 to 10% doesn't really, 8 and 10 aren't that big of numbers. But when you're talking about 8 to 10% of hundreds of thousands or millions of acres of forest land, that can translate into quite a bit. And we wanted to get a better sense of what that number was. So for our 4 million acre study area, to get to that, 340,000 newly zoned acres would be required to get to that percentage of the landscape.
I would expect a certain amount of resistance from the forest products industry if you're starting to put that much acreage off limits. Thus, the cooperative agreements where we're trying to find a better scientific way to do this.
Right. That certainly gives cooperative agreements a plug. And for our study area in particular, that 340,000 acres encompassed most of what was left. So it's not like that was some small proportion of the vast amount of mature softwood that was left remaining. That was most of it. So we'd actually have to zone most of what was left, particularly in large patches, in order to make it meaningful to a deer, in order to achieve IF&W's objective. Now, that might not be their objective anymore, but that's what the question we were asking.
Current policy seems to place a lot of emphasis on killing coyotes in order to bring back a deer herd. If there's no habitat for them, especially if the snow is just flat out too deep, is that going to get us anywhere, or can you reach a conclusion like that yet?
Well, obviously that wasn't part of our study, but my background and as a wildlife ecologist certainly would suggest that you can have lots of habitat and lots of coyote and lots of deer. But if you have no habitat, irrespective of whether or not you have coyote, you're not going to have any deer if there's no habitat for them to be into. It seems fairly straightforward. And as I said before, everybody seems to be in agreement that there's not enough habitat. So for me, from a priority standpoint, that would seem to be the first thing that would need to be addressed. It is, of course, probably the hardest thing to address.
Rezoning whole lots of acres, 300,000 acres, for instance, would probably be more difficult than just get a bunch of hunters in the woods and kill coyotes, even though that wouldn't work. It's a solution that doesn't actually help.
Right. Okay. That sounds about right.
Yeah. There's probably people throwing things at their radio right now saying, no, we got to kill coyotes. But, I know just enough to be dangerous, but coyotes to me seem able to breed rapidly, adjust their numbers, expand rapidly, taking advantage of the situation, and fleeing if there's no food and going elsewhere.
Well, and even, Dan Harrison could certainly speak to those aspects of coyote population biology better than I, but based off of what I do know is that the potential for coyote predation to impact a deer population is greatest when it's already suppressed. So when it's already not in good shape, coyote predation and predation in general can have a big effect. But if you have a robust deer population, then the effect of predation really flattens out pretty quickly. So again, for me, it's if we can have a robust population, if we can have lots of habitat that supports a robust population, then we wouldn't have to worry so much about predation.
Essentially, we're not going to do very well so long as deer are homeless.
Yes.
Erin Simons-Lagarde is my guest. She's a research assistant professor at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. Homeless deer is today's topic. What happened to all those deer in the North Maine woods? Up next, there are forestry certifications in the North Woods already. Do they just sustain wood, or can they also sustain critters? I'll ask when Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine resumes on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. I'm Bob Duchesne, host of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, and this show now airs twice each weekend, Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8. So now you've got two convenient times you can forget to tune in. Today, I'm in the office of Erin Simons-Lagarde at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. There's a new study that takes a close look at habitat loss in the North Woods, which has caused deer populations to plummet. There are certification standards in forestry. Most of those have to do with sustainability of harvest. I am unfamiliar with how much of that concerns other values like wildlife sustainability.
Well, it varies, between the FSC and the SFI programs, but wildlife habitat is certainly something that is viewed positively from the perspective of certification. I don't know that there is any additional emphasis placed on deer habitat in particular, but habitat sustainability is certainly part of that, particularly with respect to the FSC certification. SFI is more generally just about forest and harvest sustainability. Yeah,
I certainly know that the Maine Forest Products Council and a lot of its members are interested in improving fisheries because they've been working proactively on trying to upgrade some of their culverts and fish passages. And I don't know if they've gotten to the point where they're looking at the deer management situation either.
Me neither. It'd be good to know.
That could be another radio show right there. Some landowners cut harder than others. I can think of certain landowners when I cross the line in the woods. I know when I've entered their territory, it looks a little bit like craters of the moon. Do you see that? Can you tell from satellite imagery where the line is in the woods?
Yes. Oh, yeah. We can see we can see the parcel lines. We can see the township lines, even when there are big differences between adjacent neighbors. Yes, absolutely. And that picture has only gotten more complicated with all of the land ownership change. It used to be, back in the 70s and 80s, you had a few large landowners, and you could sort of see that in the harvesting patterns on the landscape. Now it's much more of a spatial mishmash we've got owners that don't even necessarily own adjacent parcels, and so we've got a total intermixing of different owners and different ownership types. And just about anything seems to be happening just about anywhere because of that intermixing.
Yeah, when I look at Google Earth, which is really my only source of looking from the air, I see a real patchwork in the woods. Whole sections that seem to have been rather denuded. Then you get to sections that are all cornrowed. Mm-hmm. And the pattern of harvesting certainly did change after the Forest Management Act.
Right, and that's corn, or that herringbone, or the sort of non-selective partial harvesting is something that we're all trying to get sort of a handle on what the effects of that have been on the forest. And like I said, for deer, we left anything that had been partially harvested in as potential deer habitat. We didn't take it off the table, and I'm sure that was a very conservative approach. So even our numbers, which in some cases are fairly large when you talk about impact, are still probably conservative, because not all the partial harvests are equal. And some of them certainly might leave adequate habitat for wintering deer, and many of them will not. And we didn't consider that.
Generally speaking, when you've got a habitat change like that, it's not just one critter that's affected. Are there others that are declining that you're aware of?
That's a good question. I'm sure they are. There are certainly concerns about mature spruce fir migratory birds, although for this project we didn't really get anywhere close to that, except
trust me, I know where they are. Or aren't anymore.
Except to years ago, Dan Harrison and Jeff Heppenstall, who was a postdoc here years ago, who did some work on looking at marten and lynx as potential umbrella species.
Yes.
And they did that by mapping out lynx or marten habitat, and then determining the degree to which that overlapped with a whole bunch of other species, suitable habitat for a whole bunch of other species based off of the Maine gap analysis. Well, they replicated that for deer, saying, okay, well, we've kind of assessed how well lynx and marten will act as umbrella species, how well do deer wintering yards act as umbrella species. So if you protect those areas, how many other species are you potentially protecting the habitat of? And we incorporated that into this research project because those results hadn't really had a chance to kind of get out there yet. And we found that deer wintering areas don't perform very well as what we call a coarse filter for biodiversity conservation. But that is probably in large part not because of what deer wintering habitat is, but how narrowly delineated the actual deer yards are.
That was my gut instinct. I was going to go out on a limb and potentially embarrass myself, and I think I'll take that risk. Marten and lynx would seem to use extremely different habitats. Marten, I would assume, is more like an old-growth forest-type critter.
Not here.
Is that right?
No, here.
No wonder I never see them.
No, well, here they are associated with mature forests, but it doesn't have to be late successional. As opposed to sort of how they behave out west, they're a little more generalist here. They can. We've learned a lot about how plastic marten's habitat requirements can actually be by how well they do in some areas of northern Maine that don't have a lot of conifer. They definitely benefit from it, particularly in the winter, for the same reason that deer do, because it gives them additional cover. But for them, it doesn't have to be late successional, maybe not as late as deer, but definitely mature.
So where are they? Because I don't remember ever seeing one in the state. I've seen them out west, but I don't think I've ever seen one in Maine, and I'm out in the woods a lot.
Well, I know they're there. We've caught a few. I actually have been out on the ground to catch them.
Okay.
And Dan Harrison and many of his graduate students obviously have a very long history of studying marten in the state. But as I said, the data were developed in part to look at marten habitat over the same period, that 1975 to current. And all of that harvesting, the story that it has to tell for marten isn't so good too, although maybe not quite so stark because they don't have that dependence on the mature conifer component year round. But at least based off of our data, it's not looking so good for marten. So the fact that you're not seeing them, crawling out of every tree is no surprise to me.
On the other hand, lynx, I guess, would profit a little bit from some of the cutting that goes on because basically that opens up territory for snowshoe hare, and so that's good for lynx.
Yes, that's precisely why we looked at both, because we didn't want to have a myopic view of the effects of past forest harvesting. And for lynx, it's been so far a good news story that all that salvage harvesting and those large efforts for herbicide application that brought much of it back to spruce fir has turned into great habitat for snowshoe hares, which is provide great foraging habitat for lynx.
Is this report? First of all, when did this report come out?
Well, right now it's out as on the Northeastern States Research Cooperative was the other funder of it, and they have a website, and we have our final report up on their website, which is basically a PowerPoint presentation. We're coming out with a more formalized written report through CFRU that, like I said, I'm hoping that we'll have that done and polished within the next month or so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is this report changing the conversation any? Or is it just going to gather dust?
Not when I've been in the room, but I'm sure that that Dan's been in the room on those kind of conversations probably much more than I have.
The report itself, does it make any recommendations, or is it just say, here's what's happening, go work it out?
Well, we always try to make recommendations, within the confines of what we feel like our information says. And what we focused on is the importance of getting a handle on the current sort of abundance and within the zoned areas before you start going, zoning new areas, establish what's actually going on with the new zones. And as I said, the good news story of the project was that many of them overlap these residual large patches of mature softwood that provides maybe a great opportunity to work with landowners that already have incorporated deer habitat management into their planning process. And how about maybe that's and maybe that effectively is what is happening with these cooperative agreements, because you've already got buy-in from some landowners that have PFWs on their landscape and sort of have to deal with management around that there are some opportunities there that IFNW should take advantage of. And how this kind of data can help to inform that, because you've got maps. We can tell you where those patches are. We can, we've got a lot of information to bring to bear that we think could help inform the conversation, whether or not it actually has yet.
This morning we're asking the question, what happened to the deer herd in the North Maine woods? My guest is Erin Simons-Lagarde at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. The loss of deer hurts more than just hunters. Sporting camps and guides have taken it out on the chin. Give us a minute and we'll get into it as Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine continues on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. You're listening to Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Yes, the show is on hold for a few weeks. I can assure you I didn't waste the time. I read some good books, learned Italian, and almost exercised. There's a new study out that looks at 32 years of satellite imagery from 1975 to 2007 to get a bird's eye view of what happened to the deer herd in the North Maine woods. Dan Harrison and Erin Simons-Lagarde teach and research at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. And what they see in the images is a rapid change in the Maine forest that isn't good for deer. First, spruce budworm, then salvaging operations, then harvesting of all trimmed wintering yards to the point where deer have no place to go in a cold climate. And even if we start now, we could be decades away from restoring enough habitat to restore the deer. Obviously, that's not good for hunters. I'm with Erin in her office right now, so let's get back into it, Erin. There are others impacted by all this as well. It's not just the forest products industry. It's hunting, fishing guides. It's sporting camps. Essentially, we've gotten into a situation, especially in the northern part of the state, where the deer herd is not there to sustain that model anymore. Certainly, we've had controversy over bear. Moose can really suffer badly because of winter tick die-offs and stuff. So we've got a whole historic industry which is on the verge of collapsing. Has there been any conversation with them in the room that you're aware of?
No, but that's because, my window into it has been primarily through the eyes of the forest land owners and those that are harvesting the forest. I'm sure they are. I think that prior to my involvement, it was there. Everybody was at the table, I think, in some initial meetings that happened at the university that sort of led up to to Dan proposing this project. Since then, I think everybody's minds are starting to shift towards, the oncoming spruce budworm outbreak. And there have been conversations in some presentations that I've given on research that we've done on that topic, on the likely impacts of the next outbreak. with people saying, okay, what's that going to mean for deer? There was
what deer?
Right.
If this comes along, what deer we got left?
And at the time, it's one of those that all the sort of moving pieces haven't come together to tell that story yet. What the likely impacts of the next outbreak are likely to be, but that's where I think these things are going to start to converge. Is everybody's going to get to the same table pretty quick as the outbreak starts to happen, and all of these sort of wildlife habitat considerations and economic considerations and social considerations are going to have to be part of that conversation.
How much panic is in the room these days when you look down the road and say, "Oops, spruce budworm coming back soon"?
Not yet. No, everybody seems to have a good handle and a good sense that we can only learn so much from the last outbreak, that we need to think proactively and creatively. We need to learn from what New Brunswick is trying. There's a lot of great new information that's available about maybe how to disrupt the outbreak before it starts, and there's lots of conversations happening around that. There was this Spruce Budworm Task Force that at the end of the month is going to be here having a big forum to unveil the report, and so, best case scenario, that's going to be a great forum to start to have a lot of these conversations, because you can't talk about salvage anymore without thinking about the habitat considerations and how those habitat considerations translate to the wildlife, and then to the people that maybe depend on wildlife as a part of their livelihood.
What is Canada doing? What have they learned that helps prepare us?
Well, there's Irving, in particular, is sort of at the forefront.
With all the spruce in Northern Maine, they've got to be particularly quaking in their boots.
And there's been based off of, just me talking here, but my understanding of the shift in their thinking about how to disrupt the outbreak is to think less about the individual stands and think more about the landscape. Try to reduce the overall load, if you will, of the pest on the landscape, and worry less about individual crop trees. So, the old mantra was don't thin, because then you're leaving your crop trees, and if budworm comes in, it's the crop trees that are going to get chewed on. Well, your crop trees are going to get chewed on anyway. If you have a really heavy outbreak, everything's going to get chewed on. But if you can just sort of knock that outbreak back, then the chances of your crop trees making it, because there's just fewer of the pests around to chew on them, is potentially a good strategy. So they're looking at sort of a 1-2 punch, where they sort of come in, they do pesticide spraying in the hot spots, and then come back a month or so later with pheromone to, again, try to just disrupt the outbreak from gaining momentum and try to keep it at closer to its endemic level.
It was pointed out to me that, yes, the last spruce budworm epidemic was pretty devastating. The next one won't be, because we just don't have as many spruce.
I think there's a lot of different people that think that, yes, the next outbreak is going to be less for a lot of different reasons, whether it's because of the forest conditions, because of its prevailing wind. But yeah, right now, the current conventional wisdom would suggest that we're headed for more of a medium kind of outbreak, not the severe one like we saw in the 70s and 80s.
But if we keep transitioning to a more deciduous forest, if climate warms up a little bit more and it encourages more of the hardwoods to recolonize, what does that do to the deer herd?
That's, a good question. I mean, everything sort of points in the direction that the conifer species might have a slightly tougher time in maintaining their foothold for a variety of different reasons. Climate change potentially being one of them. Some projections really strongly suggest that balsam fir and red spruce are just going to recede northward. And since those are major components of the deer wintering habitat, that certainly brings into question what that might mean for deer.
Is there anything else being studied that we should know about?
Lots of stuff. There's been, just this week, the one of the primary funding sources for the deer, for this particular project, the Northeastern States Research Cooperative, their pre-proposal are due tomorrow, and the hall has been abuzz with all of many, many great ideas around spruce budworm impacts and well and beyond because of that. There's been lots of conversation lately with lots of good ideas.
Well, Erin, thank you for sharing your office with me, and thank you for joining me on Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
My guest has been Erin Simons-Lagarde. a research professor at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. The new report is called The Effectiveness of State Regulations to Protect Deer Wintering Habitat in Maine. If you just can't get enough of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, it now airs twice every weekend, Saturday morning at 9 a.m. and Sunday morning at 8 a.m. And it's archived with all the previous shows on the website at 929theticket.com. Next week is going to be really different. We're traveling back in time and standing on a 10,000-year-old beach now covered in blueberries.
If you think about it, it's kind of a funny thing because sea level was 250 feet higher than it is today when there was still, at this time, ice north of us from here all the way to the St. Lawrence and up into Canada.
The Maine Ice Age Trail next week. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Dice Arts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.